These last 2 months have been full of excitement. I've been creating my wedding dress. Yes, I've been spending my weekends over the last 2 months working on this dress. And through this video, I want to share a little bit of that process with you. I'll tell you right now, this isn't a tutorial. I just wanted to share some moments from this beautiful process with you. From the very beginning, I had a very clear idea of the kind of design I wanted to create. And the truth is, when I'm designing something for myself, I usually prefer working on a dress form. While it might have been easier to work from a flat pattern, I really enjoy the process of working on the dress form. It's true that it doesn't have my exact measurements, but I'm used to that. So once I've drafted the pattern, I don't mind making a few minor adjustments or fine-tuning them on the mock-up. And that's the first thing I worked on, the bustier. If you've worked with any garment similar to a corset or bustier before, it's always a good idea to try it on with the boning in place, since that's when you'll be able to see if any tension points actually develop in a state that's as close as possible to the finished garment. The part I had to adjust the most, because my body's different from the dress form, is my hips. I have much curvier hips. In this initial phase, the dress was coming along quite nicely. The truth is, the mock-up worked almost perfectly from the start. I had to adjust the hips a little more because they were a bit too small, but overall, the lines were pretty good, aside from a few minor tweaks. As I was saying, there are always some lines you can refine a little more to make the shape look more natural. And the truth is, this is one of the least exciting parts. But now that the pattern had been tried on, tested, and everything was working well, I wanted to transfer it to paper and, of course, add the seam allowances. Honestly, I'd been wanting to work with tulle for a very long time. I really wanted to make a tulle bustier, and this was the perfect opportunity. The truth is, this part took me a very long time. It was probably one of the most time-consuming parts. I had to be very precise because this tulle fabric actually had a bit of stretch. It gave a little, and if I didn't secure it with the seams, it could have made the bustier too big or loose. But the good thing is that since this tulle is such a soft fabric, it's super comfortable to wear. once all the pieces were cut out, I ended up with a very large pattern layout, and at that point, I just had to assemble it calmly and carefully. During this phase of making the bustier, I had to do some research on materials. The type of material I wanted to use and the finish I wanted to achieve for inserting the boning. And honestly, it took a bit of work because there were some techniques I tried that I didn't really like. This particular moment was quite frustrating because after sewing the tracks for inserting the boning, I realized I didn't like the result. It hadn't turned out as perfect as I'd hoped, so I had to unpick them entirely and start the process over again using a different technique. But with trial and error, everything works out in the end. The hip pieces were pretty fun to make, though not so much to sew, since, let's not forget, I'm sewing this dress on my home sewing machine. Honestly, I didn't want a really stiff bustier. I wanted it to be comfortable to wear, so I decided to use Ridgeline type bonings. They're the most flexible ones. They don't really provide much support, so the pattern has to do its job in defining and enhancing the body's shape. And I also had to do some testing with the cup. At first, the cup I made was a little too small and I didn't feel quite comfortable with it. I preferred to make a cup that covered a little more and was a little larger. Honestly, the result was much better to my taste. I made both cups and tried on the bodice before sewing them to make sure that all the work I've done on it looks nice. I also made several prototypes of the skirt. This is the final design, although I'd initially made other test versions that didn't quite convince me because of the way the draping fell. For the skirt, I decided to use a very lightweight crepe since it's cut on the bias, so the draping has that organic shape. I was very lucky because although it wasn't planned that way, the length of the skirt at the back was just right to fit within the width of the fabric without having to add a seam. In fact, the skirt doesn't have a zipper or any other type of closure because I could slip it on from the bottom thanks to the opening created by the draping. Then I simply hooked it onto the dress at the back. As you know, the downside of white is that it's see-through, so I had to line the skirt. The truth is, sometimes it's nice to enjoy a project where you don't have to explain the process, because it allows you to work a little more freely. If I'd had to explain how this skirt was made, I would have had to standardize the process much more. However, here I was able to go with the flow a bit and do what I felt like doing for each part. Even for parts I could have sewn by machine, I didn't mind doing them in a slightly more artisanal way if that allowed me to approach the sewing process in a slightly different and less ordinary manner. Unfortunately, when I tried on the skirt, the seam where the outer fabric met the lining was showing through. That meant I had to unpick the lining and move that seam higher up so it would be covered by the draping. So once again, I had to unpick practically the entire skirt. At least on the second try, everything turned out right. At this point, the dress's structure and silhouette were already set, so it was time for that slightly more creative part, adding the lace. I opted for a cotton lace. I cut out each piece one by one. I decided to cut out several pieces so I'd have the freedom to arrange them on the bodice later. And from that moment on, it was simply a matter of letting myself go and letting my intuition guide me, along with what I was seeing in the moment. And while this part may seem super creative, and it is, you can enjoy it only until the moment you have to sew it all by hand, stitch by stitch, piece by piece. When you start sewing, it seems like it'll never end. But it does. And in the end, the experience is very satisfying. And that's what I can tell you about this adventure. So I'll sign off here and leave you with a few final shots of the finished dress.